ArtSpark Texas. ArtSpark Texas Veterans Program presents Art Smart, Art Appreciation with Judith Estrada Garcia. Lesson 1, Vincent van Gogh.
Okay, so we're going to talk about Vincent van Gogh. Okay, so listen to this song, and when you're listening to it, don't just listen to, pay attention to the words, and because it's going to make sense once we start going in through Vincent's biography. So here we go.
Watch the Van Gogh video link 1 in the description below.
Okay, so that was by Don McLean. His music, the title of the song is called Vincent, although many people call it Starry, Starry Night. Obviously, the song was about Vincent van Gogh, and it talks a little bit about the way that he created art, how he was misunderstood, and his fate. So that's some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. Life and art of Vincent van Gogh. In Starry, Starry Night, paint your palette blue and gray, look out on a summer's day with eyes that know the darkness in my soul. So it's almost like he's talking as though he's Vincent himself. Vincent van Gogh was not the first Vincent. Actually, his mother had a child before him, and she named him Vincent van Gogh. And he died a year within the year that he was born. That was 1852. Vincent was born in 1853. At the age of in 1964, he was sent to a boarding school in Zevenberg, and I can't even say that word. And then at the age of 14, he started working at the Hague Gallery. He was basically going to be a gallerist, as his brother Theo was, and his mother had come from a famous gallery. They had owned famous galleries throughout Europe. So they thought that was a perfect place for him to work. He wasn't doing too well, so they transferred him to London at the age of 16. But Vincent was very known for having a lot of aggression and fighting with people and quarreling and arguing. So in London, he didn't do so well, so they decided, well, we'll send him to Paris. Again, in Paris, the same thing happened, and Vincent was very, very aggressive, and just I don't think that was really what he wanted. He didn't really like to be around people very much. And so, of course, being a salesman, you have to be around people, you have to please people, and that was not Vincent's normal behavior. That was not what he wanted to be. He was very confrontational, and he didn't follow the rules very well. So at the age of 19, he wanted to work as a minister. His father had been a minister, and so he wanted to devote his life to evangelism. So he went to the town of Bornag, Belgium. He worked with the poor and hardworking people of the coal mines there. He was, again, his aggressiveness, but this time lack of respect for the church leadership, forbade him from continuing his studies at the Flemish School for Evangelists. He was a very good, he really took care of the people. He really cared for the people in the coal mine. And in fact, they would call him the Christ of the people. But as his behavior got more aggressive and erratic, his father even worried about having committing Vincent to a psychiatric institution, in this case, Gill. So it was already known that he was starting to have a behavior that was not consistent with, well, especially his family that was well respected. His father, minister, his mother, a family of respected gallery owners. And of course, Theo was the younger brother by 4 years, and he was a pretty popular gallerist himself, an art dealer. This was a drawing that he first made as when he was with the coal miners, and well, they said he was punished by his family and sent there, and by the church. But of course, like I said before, he didn't follow rules very well. But this is where he started his art interest and art drawing. Did a lot of drawings, and the coal miners' families, they loved him, and they called him, like I said, the Christ of the coal miners. This is another painting that he did. Vincent painted in oils, So you see here the struggles of the people. He loved to paint the struggles of men and women and how hard they had their lives. Here again is another painting. Here you see him developing the strokes of light and the movement of light. So you start seeing that in this earlier painting. Okay. Shadows on the hills sketch the trees and the daffodils, catch the breeze and the winter's chills in colors on the snowy linen land. You know, he came from the Netherlands, and so it was very cold there, and the colors were always very dark, which obviously affected his behavior and personality. So he drew and he painted very dark images at that time. Here's one of his famous paintings of his shoes, of the coal miners. Here we see a different view. Two figures by Vincent van Gogh, painted in June 1890, 1 month before his death. So from the first time you see his paintings that are dark and cold and sad, by the time, about the time of his death, all that time it took him to create much more beautiful, vibrant, live and colorful paintings. So, and he only really painted for 10 years of his life, from the age of 27 to 37. So, as I was talking about how in this case, now I understand that you tried to say to me and how you suffered for your sanity and how you tried to set them free. Again, here is a drawing of Cian. She was well, they thought she was a prostitute. I guess she when she first met him, she was pregnant with another man's child, and he took her in, he took care of her, and another child that she had, a little girl. And this depicts sorrow. So this was one of his models. Of course, Vincent didn't have very much money. His brother Theo used to send him 50 francs a month to help support him, because Vincent was never able to hold a paying job in his life, basically from his erratic behavior and his developing mental issues that he was having. But Cian was one of the ladies that he lived with. He really cared about her. But at the end, due to the pressure from his family, he had to separate from her because the family threatened to take any payments away from him. So he had to leave her. So it was very sad that he left her, and he moved on. Artistic intentions. Around 1880, encouraged by his brother Theo, and of course, after all the jobs that he had lost, he was actually a teacher's aide, a bookkeeper. Of course, he tried to be a minister and a gallerist, but every job that he took, he wasn't able to be successful, and would get fired. But Theo believed in him, and Theo encouraged him to make a serious effort to be an artist. So he left Brussels in October 1880 to obtain further training. They would not listen, did they not, did not know how perhaps they'll listen now. Vincent was always misunderstood. And so he would spend a lot of time by himself. He would spend time at the local cafe, and he would paint people. And but he didn't have any friends. He didn't socialize. He didn't do any of that stuff. But for him, it was actually viewing people and drawing and painting what he saw. He respected the people so much. So in this one piece that he made called The Potato Eaters, these are people that worked in the coal mines and people that did not, were very poor. So he painted them, and he painted the expressions on their faces. Van Gogh was what was very important for Van Gogh was to get emotion from the paintings. That was very important to him. Okay, in 1886, Van Gogh decides to move to Paris, because Paris is where it's happening. Paris is where the artists are. And Paris is where he's going to be. He learns about the Impressionistic style, which adopted the short, quick brushstrokes and colorful palette of the Impressionists. However, this was not where he was going to stay. He was going to move on beyond Impressionism and created his own a unique post-impressionist aesthetics. What he did was have bold, swirly colors, which were inspired by nature like the Impressionists, but he went far beyond that. Again, what was important for him is to get emotion. That was the most important thing for him. Symbolic emotion from the landscape, from the people, from whatever it was he was painting, there was going to be an emotional impact there. Starry, starry night, flaming flowers that brightly blaze, swirling clouds and violet haze reflect in Vincent's eyes of china blue. You can see this is a self-portrait of himself. He painted himself a lot because he didn't have very much money. And to get a model, of course, you have to pay them, but he never had money, even though, of course, Theo gave him money every month to attain a place to live, some food, and to buy his art supplies. But he didn't have enough money to hire a model, so he'd always paint himself in different ways. In 1880, Van Gogh began painting his famous sunflowers, but also this was where he was beginning to suffer more of his mental issues. There was a lot of sunflowers. He pretty much, there were 7 that were important, and those are the ones that are now owned by the museums and family. Actually, a few family members had some, but and some of the people where he stayed had a few of the paintings. Okay. In September 1880, September completion, Starry Night over Rome. Now this is not the Starry Night that we're all used to, but this was one of the first ones that he did. As you can see when you were listening to the music and you saw the art on the video, he used very thick paint. He'd sometimes take the paint right out of the tubes and paint it onto the canvas. And that created light. The way he put the strokes created light. And then also how he, like you could see the light reflecting on the water, not only because of the use of the yellows on the blues, but also because of the thick paint that he used. Colors changing hue, morning fields of amber grain, withered faces lined in pain are soothed beneath the artist's loving hand. Yeah. It looks to me, by the research I've done, was that he went from cold colors to warm colors. Now, of course, you know, the Starry, Starry Night and some of those, yes, he used the darker colors, but as you can still tell, there's still light. So as he progressed throughout his painting career, he started dark with his drawings, working in the coal mines, and during his very depressive time, you know, trying to be a minister, trying to work at the other jobs, and he slowly became more in love with the warm, strong colors. So you'll see that as you progress with his art. So here we see this is 1888. Now, keep in mind, in 1890, he took his own life. Of course, there's been some disagreements whether he took his own life or did other people took his life. So right now, as it stands, what I know is that he took his own life, but we'll discuss that a little lot later. But yeah, it's 1888, September. The Café Thérèse at the Place du Forum in Arles, which is in France, which is where he ended up staying after his travels. But you see the colors, even though he uses the dark, for the background, he uses color and light and movement because this is what makes him happy, which is funny because he didn't socialize with people very much. But to paint this scene, you would think he was a more social person, but he wasn't. This is a completion of his bedroom in Arles. A little bedroom. I mean, this is a very famous one, as we all know. He actually shared this with Paul Gauguin when Gauguin came to live with him for a little bit. And Van Gogh had had invited a lot of the artists that he had met in Paris to come live with him, but they were not interested. Of course, probably because of his argumentative personality and his fights that he picked with everybody. But they were not interested in coming. Gauguin was the only one, but it could have been because Vincent's brother, Theo, had given money to Gauguin to go live with Vincent to help him paint and keep him company, because Gauguin was not making a lot of money. Although he was selling some of his paintings in Paris, he wasn't making a lot of money. And Gauguin was very much a womanizer, and he loved to drink, loved to party, he loved to be, out and about and spending the money he had. So when Theo gave him this money and say, hey, you know what, I give you a stipend every month to live in France with my brother Vincent, keep him company, help him out. Vincent just needs a friend. So Gauguin did come live with him in this tiny little place where I don't know how they shared their accommodations, but um, this is where they stayed. But actually, Vincent, in this same place, in this little yellow house, which it was called, was he did have two rooms. He had a room for his studio where he actually did, created his artwork, and he had a room where he slept. And he ate in the cafe at the yellow house. That was included in his rent. So now I understand what you tried to say to me and how you suffered for your sanity and how you tried to set them free. Set them free, I believe, was how Vincent saw the world and wanted the world to see the brightness and the just the movement of the light, because he saw things differently. I mean, obviously, it's probably his mental the sanity, how it was declining. But it was said, I'd read somewhere, that Vincent used to lick the paintbrushes, just to make them probably pointy so he can get them on the canvas a certain way. But paints back then, and probably still some, contain lead. Of course, lead, you consume that, and that will end up in having nervous disabilities and mental disabilities. So that's just something I had read in my course of study, and I thought that was probably makes a lot of sense. However, of course, as a young child, his father and the other circumstances of his life, there was some sort of disorder there. It's probably antisocial personality of some type. But I thought that was interesting. Okay. Um, on January 31st, in 1890, this is the only painting that was sold, the Red Vineyards, while Vincent was alive. This is the only one. And it's a beautiful piece. You see the movement, you see the people. And for him, like I said, it's symbolism. And you see in the distance, the horizon. It's a beautiful piece. Um, July of that year is when he took his life. But this is such a mastery from his cold, dark paintings that he did before. And this is at the height of his mental breakdown, where he had been in an asylum, and because, as we all know, he had cut off his left ear. And even at the height of his mental breakdown, he was able to have these beautiful pieces that he made, and it almost goes back to your question about his mental state and the colors he was using. But almost like this is almost like the opposite of it, because the more mentally ill he became, the more bright and fantastic and amazing pieces that he made. So, like I said, this is the only piece that was sold by his brother Theo while he was alive. Now I understand what you tried to say to me and how you suffered for your sanity and how you tried to set them free. Oh, okay, I went backwards. Okay, so I don't know if this is an actual quote that Van Gogh said, but maybe God made me a painter for people who aren't born yet. I would assume that Vincent knew that his painting was as more, it was not normal during that time. In fact, a lot of his paintings people thought were ugly because of the thick strokes and the context of the art that he used. So here's a little clip that I want to play to you.
Watch the Van Gogh video link 2 in the description below.
Okay, again, we talked about the Yellow House. This is where he lived when he was in France. And actually, this has been torn down because during World War I, it was bombed. So it's no longer there. It's actually a park now. But this is where he lived the rest of his life, and him and Paul Gauguin lived for a little bit, and he painted a lot of people in the little town, and beautiful little scene. Kind of sad, you know. Think that this was about the end of his life. This is an interesting painting because Vincent didn't paint it. Gauguin painted it of Vincent. And it was said that Gauguin made fun of Vincent because Gauguin thought you should paint from your imagination. But Vincent painted for what he saw, what he saw. That was what beautiful. He wanted to paint reality and painted in a positive way. Well, Paul Gauguin painted Vincent in a kind of disturbed way, in a way to make fun of him. And so this is a kind of, I mean, it's a very nice piece, but it's very sad to think that his only friend painted him to make fun of him. But again, their friendship ended in 1888. Gauguin left. They would not listen. They did not know how perhaps they'll listen now. And of course, we all know what happened to him. He cut off a portion of his ear, and then he committed himself to a mental asylum in Saint Remy.
Watch the Van Gogh video link 3 in the description below.
Now, there was some controversy as to whether Vincent had cut off his whole ear or only the lower portion of his ear. And when this movie was done with Kirk Douglas, that was in 1950. And so some of the people were still alive that lived during the time of Van Gogh, because he perished and died in 1890. And so the director had gone back to France to find out what really happened. And there were documents on what had happened to him and what his ear had looked like. And so when they were digging through the files, the historical files in France, they found the medical doctor's drawing of how the ear was cut. And it showed that he cut directly the whole ear, except leaving a tiny portion after the horrible cutting that he did with a blade. So that was interesting because that was what 60 years after the fact, and they were still able to find the evidence of what had happened. I thought that was very interesting. But again, like I said, he put himself into a mental asylum at Saint Remy because he knew he just needed help. That was what he needed. I want you to see in the background of this piece right here, some what looks like Japanese art in the back, and he was actually he was inspired by the Japanese prints that were taking hold of Paris during that time. So there was some techniques that he used from the Japanese to create some of his art. But you might see in some of his paintings some Japanese influence in the back. Okay, for they could not love you, but still your love was true. And when no hope was left inside on that starry night, Van Gogh, his lonely little chair with his pipe and a message. In 1898 made the completion of the irises. Of course, we all know this beautiful, famous piece. You can find this everywhere. I mean, his art is everywhere, on bags, on shoes, on shirts, on hats, everywhere you can see. I mean, most popular man today in his artwork. Everybody can recognize his artwork. Everybody recognizes his name. You took your life as lovers often do, but I could have told you, Vincent, this world was never meant for one as beautiful as you. This was one of his initial drawings. Again, lonely, symbolic, emotional impact. And here it is, Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh at Saint Remy. This was actually painted in the asylum from his window. The scene that he actually saw from this window was not what you see on the painting. This is actually a compilation of different views that he saw. Because at the point he was in his window, he couldn't see all of this, but he could see the sky. The tree had been a little more distant. The village had been a lot more distant. So this is something he took from his imagination and his memory and painted it. Remember I told you a little bit about the Japanese art and his influence? Well, okay, I'm going to have a hard time with this word, but Katsushika and Hokuhari's The Great Wave off Kanagawa. He studied Japanese art in Paris, and it is believed that he might have used the Great Wave as an influence in his curling winds on Starry Night. This is like one of the opinions, of course, from art critics. But because the Great Wave was painted before Vincent started painting, so could happen. Oh, okay. So this is actually one of the paintings that Van Gogh did. He copied the Japanese art to learn how it was used. So even though he copied this from an original print, this is what Van Gogh painted himself. Starry, starry night, portraits hung in empty halls, frameless heads on nameless walls with eyes that watch the world and can't forget. Again, when I talked to you about the Japanese influence, you can see that in the back. You can see the geisha girl on the right lower, and appears maybe I'm not sure, maybe that's a warrior or something in the top. In the very top, you see what may be some Japanese people walking in the winter time, and then you see the cherry blossoms upper right hand side, and Mount Fuji on the very top of the man's hat. So it's interesting to see his influence there. Okay, here's another painting influenced by his Japanese love of art. His love of Japanese art was the almond blossom. Again, this is February 1890. Like strangers that you've met, the ragged men in ragged clothes, a silver thorn, a bloody rose, lie crushed and broken on the virgin snow. Again, very sad painting. Okay, 1890 May, Van Gogh leaves Saint Remy and begins contacting his brother Theo. 1890 May, leaves the asylum to begin care in Alversuusi under Dr. Paul Gachet, who was recommended by Camille Pissarro. Camille Pissarro, of course, is another very famous artist. So this is where you're seeing his demise, and this is where you're seeing he knows he needs help. He knows something's wrong. Now I think I know what you tried to say to me and how you suffered for your sanity and how you tried to set them free.
Watch the Van Gogh video link 4 in the description below.
So, July 29th, 1890, Vincent van Gogh died of a self-inflicted gunshot. This is also questioned because it's also thought that he might have been accidentally shot by these two boys that were playing cowboys and Indians, and but that's one of the controversies and adds to the allure of the great Vincent van Gogh. They would not listen, they're not listening still, perhaps they never will. So we've concluded the talk about the artist himself. And what we're going to talk about real quick now is to give you some information for your project that if you choose to take it on for next week. Just talk about a little bit between the difference between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Impressionist painters painted outdoors. Of course, they paved the way for Post-Impressionism, Cubism, and Fauvism, but they concentrated more on the subject. They stressed the significance of the heat of the subject. Such famous painters were Degas, Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, and Mary Cassatt. Now the difference, and this is where Van Gogh and Cezanne and Gauguin and Seurat, how they changed the post-impressionist paintings, the impressionist painted post-impressionists, because they completed their work in the studio. Even though you saw Vincent going out and painting outside, most of the impressionists painted or finished their work in the studio. The important point to focus on is that post-impressionism paved the way for modern art. Basically, the emphasis is emotional aspect of human behavior. Their focus was a symbolic contact of the painting, of the person, of the landscape, of the object. And those famous painters are Cezanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Seurat. So might want to look at them before you do your project. Okay, so your art project is going to be to create a drawing or painting using the post-impressionistic style, using emotional symbolism to portray a feeling or emotion you feel. And what we'll do is we'll share it the first 15 minutes of the class. If you send it to me, or send it to April in time, we can put it in a PowerPoint, and that way we can all look at it and discuss it in the first 15 minutes of the class.
Images of art created based on Vincent van Gogh. Lesson 2, Yayoi Kusama.
Her history, what she does, what does she create. But if you don't right now, you will end up going, oh yeah, I know who that is. So it's just a little history about her. She's got a very long history. She's 91 years old, and so she's been doing art her entire life. And a lot of what she's done may not have been popular at the time she did it. And people thought she was strange for doing it. And even Japan, her home country, was embarrassed by her, and they felt humiliated. Even her family was humiliated by the type of art and the messages she sent out through her art. But okay. So it's funny you talked about, being alone in the COVID environment right now. And she was lovely enough to send out a message in April 2020 about this. So this is her message. She's also a poet and novelist. A message from Yayoi Kusama to the whole world. Though it glistens just out of reach, I continue to pray for hope to shine through. It's glimmer lighting our way, this long-awaited great cosmic glow. Now that we find ourselves on the dark side of the world, the gods will be there to strengthen the hope we have spread throughout the universe. For those left behind, each person's story and that of our loved ones, it is time to speak a hymn of love for our souls. In the midst of this historic menace, a brief burst of light points to the future. Let us joyfully sing this song of a splendid future. Let's go. Embraced in deep love and in the efforts of people all over the world, now is the time to overcome, to bring peace. We gathered for love, and I hope to fulfill that desire. The time has come to fight and overcome our happiness. To COVID-19 that stands in our way, I say, disappear from this earth. We shall fight. We shall fight this terrible monster. Now it is time for the people of the world to stand up. My deep gratitude goes to all those who are already fighting. Revolutionist of the World by the art of Yayoi Kusama. Well, that's like her. She was always a fighter. From a young child and continuing now, she's a fighter. Um, this is her. She grew up in Japan in March 22nd, 1929, in Matsumasa, Japan. The Japanese artist, who was a self-described obsessional artist, known for extensive use of polka dots in her infinity installations. She employed painting, sculpture, performance art, and installations in a variety of styles, including pop art. Yayoi Kusama was born the youngest daughter of a well-to-do family in a mountainous region of Matsumoto in central Japan. This is a portrait of Yayu in her room in her parents' house in 1957. By her own account, Kusama began painting as a child at about the time she began experiencing hallucinations that often involved fields of dots. Those hallucinations and the theme of dots would continue to inform her art throughout her career. She had little formal training, studying art only briefly from 1948 to 1949 at the Kyoto City Specialist School of Art. Family conflict and the desire to become an artist drove her to move in 1957 to the United States, where she settled in New York City. She had written one of the artists, Georgia O'Keeffe, to ask her about how to become an artist. She wrote her and sent her some watercolor paintings. And Miss O'Keeffe says, well, if you come here to where I live in New Mexico, there's not much art here. You'll have to go to New York. That's where the art scene is. So Yayu came to America. She had her first exhibition in Washington State. Georgia O'Keeffe helped her with that, and some of her watercolor paintings were sold. After some time with Georgia told her, go to New York. That's where you're going to have an impact. Yayoi Kusama began paintings out of acrylic, very large scale paintings. This one right here is 33 feet in width. And the reason she painted these little nets, basically just acrylic semicircles, and she continuously did that on the surface of this canvas. She said she had seen this when she was flying over the Pacific Ocean to the United States. And all these, this is the same repetition she made. Simple little semicircles on these canvases. She first exhibited these paintings, White Infinity Nests in Europe, and its select concentration of those iconic works in the exhibition recalls Kusama's debut solo show in New York at the Brada Gallery in October 1959. From a distance, these delicate paintings read as monochromes, but up close, their intricate surface become visible, small, arced semicircles of white paint almost completely covering the ground of the canvases. On each painting, the underlay, a wash of gray or black, is obscured by an intricate network of gestural scallops of paint that combine to form a net. The paintings are characterized by an all-over surface that combines to form a net. The paintings are characterized, surface that suggests detailed lattice or lace work. The nets appear to extend beyond the picture's planes, suggesting the potential to expand indefinitely. These nets were first produced in 1950s and 1960s. Although they were white, she subsequently also made colored net paintings. Since these first iterations, she has returned periodically to the infinity nets, and these works have become a touchstone in her practice for over half a century. Her repeated revisiting and expansions of this significant body of work highlights its continued appropriateness to the artist. Her adoption of the infinity net for her autobiography also reflects their standing throughout her career. Such work explored the physical and psychological boundaries of painting, with a seemingly endless repetition of the marks, creating an almost hypnotic sensation for both the viewer and the artist. Her paintings from that period anticipated the emerging minimalist movement, but her work soon transitioned to pop art and performance art. She became a central figure in the New York avant-garde, and her work was exhibited alongside such artists as Donald Judd, Claes Oldenburg, Andy Warhol. Interesting to note that Donald Judd is the artist that came to Texas and created the Marfa museums. This is her in front of her large infinity net, the white one, and you can see on the upper right-hand side, it was basically an impasto. She created the little scallops, but she also used a lot of paint to create this textual image. And there she is on the bottom right-hand side, creating these small little scallops. But she did this basically 24/7. She would work for hours and hours and hours, and somebody had to go over there and make sure she ate, got some rest. The word obsession comes to mind because that's what she did. Art was an obsession for her. And the way she performed her art, it was obsession. I guess sometimes you call it nowadays obsessive compulsive. I don't know if that was something that was popular in that age as far as a psychological impairment, as it were. But if it was, it's obviously what her talent was about, is the concentration and the peace she felt when she was making these pieces. One question that she wanted to ask people is, how are these particles forming the negative spaces in the net? How deep was the mystery? Did infinity exist beyond our universe? In exploring these questions, I wanted to examine the single dot that was my own life. One polka dot, a single particle among billions. I issued a manifesto stating that everything, myself, others, the entire universe, would be obliterated by white nets of nothingness, connecting astronomical accumulations of dots. White nets enveloping the dark dots of silent death against a pitch dark background of nothingness. By the time the canvas reached 33 feet, it had transcended its nature as a canvas to fill the entire room. This was my epic, summing up all that I was, and the spell of the dots and the mesh enfolded me into a magical curtain of mysterious, invisible power. Yayu moved on from that and started creating dots on objects. And she would put these objects into mirrored rooms, much like the fun houses that you come into carnivals. But I would expect that this isn't that scary. Like I was scared of those mirrored rooms because it never seemed like you would ever get away and you were trapped in there. I always had that kind of fear of being trapped. But in this instance, she puts the mirrors to represent infinity. I mean, there's been artists that have created paintings that say infinity, they title infinity and they want to get out that message of infinity. However, in her performance art, installation art, the true meaning of infinity is there. as you see with the mirrors that will constantly reflect the same images over and over and over again. I mean, this is the definition of infinity. This one in particular is called the Phallus Field, 1965. A mirrored room where floors were covered with hundreds of stuffed phallus that had been painted with red dots. Kusami spent much of her time between 1962 and 1964 sewing thousands of stuffed fabric tubers and grafting them to furniture and found objects to create her accumulation sculptures. She exhibited the works together in an attempt to create hallucinatory scenes of phallic surfaces, but found the labor involved to making them physically and mentally taxing. In response to her labor-intensive work, she started to utilize mirrors to achieve similar repetition. Infinity Mirror Room, Phallus Field, was perhaps the most important breakthrough for Kusami during this immensely fruitful period. The reflective surface allowed her vision to transcend the physical limitations of her own productivity. Furthermore, the mirrors created a participatory experience by casting the visitor as the subject of the work, a feature that the artist demonstrated through a provocative series of self-portraits in which she used her body to activate the space. The work first appeared in the exhibition floor, the Castilian Gallery in New York City in 1965. The Infinity Room, Mirror Room, the large-scale mirrored installation, was part of her solo exhibition floor show at the Castellane Gallery, New York, in 1965. Mirrors gave her the opportunity to create infinity planes in her installations, and she would continue to use them in later pieces. This was her phallus chair. Obsessive repetition continued to be a theme for Kusami's sculpture and installation art as she began to exhibit in the early 1960s. The theme of sexual anxiety linked much of that work, in which Kusami covered the surface of objects such as the armchair accumulation number 1, 1962, with small, soft, phallic structures constructed from white fabric. The thing about this, she was creating these tubular soft sculpture installation, was her fear of sex. And the reason she said she had a fear of sex was when she was growing up as a child in Japan, her father was a womanizer, huge womanizer. And her mother would send her out to go and spy on the father. And so this young girl of 10 years old would have to go and spy on her father, which at many times he was actually in the act of sexual intercourse with another woman. And this was many times that this occurred. And then Kusami would have to return home and tell her mother about these events. And this put a huge traumatic strain on her young mind that continued into her adulthood. As you can see, she would say, well, if I confront my fears, I will overcome my fears. And this was her way of trying to do that. She says, to make accumulation number 1, her first sculpture, Kusami covered an armchair with scores of hand-sewn, stuffed, and painted protrusions, which she referred to as phalluses. I make them and I make them and then keep on making them until I bury myself in the process. I call this obliteration. When she first exhibited this work in New York, her home throughout the 1960s, critics were perhaps not surprisingly shocked by the sexualized transformation of ordinary domestic objects by a female artist. As you can see, these were everywhere. She did this absolutely everywhere. There was times when even O'Keeffe contacted her and said, "Are you okay? Do you need some help?" And she would send people to go and help her because she would trap herself in her studio to make these phalluses. She did that herself. So that was very, very tiring for her. And of course, it had to be mentally draining as well. After the time that she was making her fallacy, she started to expand more into the art scene. And she did a lot of performance arts, exploring anti war, anti establishment, and free love ideas. She called these happenings, which often involved the public, nudity, and with a stated intention of disassembling and disarming boundaries of identity, sexuality, and the body. In the grand orgy to awaken the dead in 1969, Kusama painted dots on participants' naked bodies in an unauthorized performance in the fountain of the Sculpture Garden in New York City's Museum of Modern Art. Critics accused her of intense self-promotion, and her work is regularly covered in the press. Grand Orgy appeared in the front page of the New York Daily News. Since 1967, she had a lot of happenings and fashion shows, not only in New York, but also in Holland and Rome. As she got more active, she was influenced by anti-Vietnam War movement and the American presidential election, and social elements were added to her work. She started creating Kusama dress and textiles, which were sold at department stores and boutiques all over the United States. In 1969, she opened up her own boutique. Around 1972, with all the work that she was doing, all the intensity and mental strain that was upon her for creating all this amazing and new work, and also with the critics constantly on her about the type of work she was doing. Of course, she was a little woman from Japan coming into New York and trying to break into the New York scene was mostly were about men, male artists. So she basically had a mental breakdown. Georgia O'Keeffe recommended a psychiatrist, and Kusama, she went home, she went back to Japan during this time. Kusama moved back to Japan in 1973, and in 1977, by her own choice, she lived in a mental hospital. She continued to produce art during that period and also wrote surreal poetry and fiction, including The Hustler's Grotto of Christopher Street in 1984 and Between Heaven and Earth in 1988. Now, this is the interesting part. A few of you learned about Joseph Cornell, the reclusive artist in New York City that created assemblages, little boxes of found objects in New York City. Well, as it turned out, Kusama and Cornell were known to have been an item. This picture is hard to see, but Cornell did this little poem on this one assemblage with little butterflies to announce his love for her. And the problem wasn't that he didn't want to see her and she didn't want to see him. The problem was that his mother was very aggressive about their relationship and did not approve of it. It is said that at one time they were together and kissing in the backyard, and the mother came over and dumped a bucket of cold water over her head. And that Cornell didn't apologize to Kusama, he apologized to his mother for this happening. So, of course, as delicate as was her mental state, Kusama left the United States and went back to Japan and stayed in that mental hospital, which she actually still continues to live in. Her studio is across the street from it, where she still continues to do that wonderful art that she does. Okay. One of the installation works that she does is pretty magnificent. You see here a pure white room, furniture, artifacts, cups and flowers. Everything is absolutely white. The ceiling's white, the floor is white, everything is absolutely white. Now, with Kusami, she wanted to share her art with the world, and she felt that every person was a creative artist. So we're going to watch a short little video about her obliteration room.
Watch the Kasama video link 1 in the description below.
As you can see, everything is covered in dots. And I mean, one of her central ideas was to decentralize art. You know, normally when you have a painting or you see art, there's always, like Rudy was talking at perspective, there's always a line. Uh, there's always, your eye should be directed to a certain pattern. There should be symmetry. But she doesn't do that. What she wants you to do is to see the entire work as one. And then she wants to bring you into the work so that you're part of it. This is something that she does all the time. And she started it so early, especially in her happenings, that this is her central focus. She wants to have people immersed in the art, be part of the art, and then create art. Kusama returned to the international art world in 1989 with shows in New York City and Oxford, England. In 1993, she represented Japan at the Venice Biennial with work that included Mirror Room Pumpkin, an installation in which she filled a mirrored room with pumpkin sculptures covered in her signature dots. Between 1998 and 1999, a major retrospective of her work was shown at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Tokyo's Museum of Contemporary Art. In 2006, she received Japan's Art Association Premium in Pirelli. Oh, I am terrible at spelling and pronunciation. I am so sorry. Prize for painting. Her work was the subject of major retrospective at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City in 2012. And a traveling expedition attracted record crowds at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, Washington, D.C. In 2017, the year that she opened, a museum dedicated her work in Tokyo near her studio and the psychiatric hospital where she lives. See, even George Clooney wears her art. I think that's pretty interesting. This is her surrounded by some of her new types of art that she's doing and some of the large sculptures that she does, all colorful. And now look at her art now. It's no longer just, you know, the circles, but there's still little circles within all that, little dots within all that. And she completes one of these in one setting. It's acrylic, so that's nice because it dries pretty fast. She does that in her little studio in Japan. And this is some of the writing that she's done. She's a writer and poet. Manhattan Suicide Attic, The Hustler's Grotto. I mean, but I haven't read only but one or two of her poems, so pretty interesting. Here's her famous pumpkin. She said something about the pumpkin that it's not a, what is it? She said everybody can use the pumpkin for all different things. There it is. There she is at her work. 91 years old, still creating. some citations.
Art project. Create something repetitive or obsessively. Images of artwork inspired by Yayoi Kusama. Lesson 3, Rick Bartow.
Is Rick Bartow. Have any of you ever heard of Rick Bartow? No. I didn't know anything about this artist except when I ended up looking at one of his pieces. You know, I get curious about artists and I'm just always snooping on the art scene, what's going on, what's happening. But he's passed now. He died in 2016, April 2nd. But I ended up following his art and just falling in love with him and his art. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Native artist and Vietnam veteran Rick Bartow confronts loss and recovery. Okay, so this is the type of art that Rick Bartow does. Here's Dear Spirit for Frank Laoena, somebody he must have been a friend with. But we're going to go and look at a quick video.
Watch the Bartow video link 1 in the description below.
Rick's father was a Native American, Wiyot, New York, and his mother was European American. He freely blended European and Native influences, mostly about transformation, animal spirits, human spirits, meeting, mingling, becoming expressions of one another. Basically a metamorphosis between the animal and the human. This was fascinating, sometimes reflective of an inner turmoil because, as he once said, I don't deal well with change. Rick Bartow was born December 1946 in Newport, Oregon, a Native American artist and member of the Mad River Band of Wiyot Indians, a small tribe indigenous to the Humboldt County, California. Rick Bartow's artwork is stirring and expressive. He combines contemporary artist methods and techniques traditional to the Wiyot heritage to portray transformative and spiritual figures. He created work out of pastel, graphite, mixed media drawings, wood sculptures, acrylic paintings, dry point etchings, and monotypes. The Wiyot Indians are an indigenous people of California living near the Humboldt Bay and surrounding areas. They are culturally similar to the Yurok people of California. Their stretch of shoreline was mostly sandy tidal marshes. The Wiyot were among the last Native Americans in California to encounter white settlers. The Mad River Band Wiyot, a tribe which thrived in Northern California before being massacred in large numbers in the 1960s by vigilante settlers. The Mia massacre took place February 26, 1860, at Tuluwat, on what is now known as Indian Island, near Eureka in Humboldt, California. The tribes of a few thousand Wiyot and Cargo people living in that area in 1850 dramatically changed after the 1960 massacre, and by 1910 there were fewer than 100 full-blooded Wiyot people living within the Wiyot territory of California. The rapid decline in population was from disease, slavery, dying in protective custody, being herded from place to place in what survivors and descendants described as death marches, target practice, and outright murder. Only recently has the Wiyot Indian tribe repurchased the land in order to perform their annual world renewal ceremony. In 1969, Rick graduated from the Western Oregon University with a degree in secondary arts education. Rick was then drafted into the Army and served in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, 1969 and 1971. He ended up as a sergeant in 72 Bravo Company, Singapore. He played with a band which appeared first in the officers' clubs, but later sent to perform at military hospitals to boost morale. Confronted with the wounded and dying, Bartow was overwhelmed. Survivor's guilt followed him home and his world fell apart. He had nightmares, went through a divorce, took on a series of odd jobs, and most damaging, his drinking became out of control. Bartow says that much of his early work was about exorcising demons, and he had plenty of demons to deal with, including a tough tour of duty in Vietnam, drug abuse, and alcoholism. When I returned from Vietnam, like so many others, I was a bit twisted, he had written. I was a house filled with irrational fears, beliefs, and symbols. Wind-blown paper would send me running. Crows became my many things. I never remembered dreams and detested the wind. I wore bells on my wrists so I could hear my parts when they moved. I slept in my clothes so I'd be ready to go nowhere at all. And I recall once answering when asked my name and where I was from. Nobody, nowhere. I must have been a wonderful companion, he sarcastically said. Personal experiences, literature, and art from around the globe inform Bartow's art. Throughout his career, he was consistently exploring self-portraiture, and animal imagery, often blurring the lines between the two. Many describe his work as transformational in visual storytelling, accustomed to narrative. Just like you see this one, man acting like dog. Bartow was a long-life musician, having written lyrics and music found on several CD collections. He sang lead and played lead and guitar with the Backstreet Drivers every week in Newport. If you get a chance to look them up, go ahead and look them up. Beautiful music. One video is around an hour long. I couldn't play it here, but gorgeous, gorgeous music. We'll watch another quick video.
Watch the Bartow video link 2 in the description below.
So he says, when I'm working, I'm simply working, setting up problems visually that need resolution. In the process, I'm looking for resolution to conundrums in my life, questions in my life, as well as visually looking for problems that I can fix. I mean, you can all recognize that in an artist. As an artist, you all have problems that you need to fix. Just as, Rudy did that one piece with all the repeating words and the colors. Those are problems we wanted to fix, and he fixed them in the way that he wanted to represent his ideas for 2020. Here we have Crow's Creation 5. In a 2011 review of his exhibition Coyote Road at Froelich, Rick's art, his drawings, prints, and paintings, which were once mainly black and white, have long since evolved into a fluid and colorful palette set down with almost scrawling sense of urgency that suggests the painful and illuminating moment when a being realizes it's becoming someone or something entirely different, yet somehow also the same. In European terms, it's the werewolf moment, with all the turmoil of otherness and connectedness that implies. The enduring astonishment of Bartow's work is that somehow he captures the almost unbearable beauty of the moment of transformation, that moment at which we come to realize that we are more than what we realized we were. It's strangely a moment of birth and a moment that can be expressed many times. This piece is called From Nothing, Coyote Creates Himself. 2004, carved wood. It's 41 by 84 inches. Ay, ay, ay. What the heck? Okay. Crow's side of tail and bear with humor. These are two different pieces during the same period of time. The birds and the salmon in his paintings and wood carvings pay tribute to the wildlife of the Oregon's central coast, while coyotes, dogs, and bears, sometimes in partly human form, appear as fearsome beasts in the midst of metamorphosis. A writer said, animals in Bartow's world may be tricksters, companions, guardians, or adversaries. They always seem to be in the act of becoming, but it's not clear whether the outcome is joy or terror, hurt or healing. The menace, the humor of Bartow's art suggests that they can be all those things at once. Here's another piece, Fox Spirit, 2011, mixed media. If I read it right, he had found the fox and he was trying to keep it alive. He wasn't a taxidermist, but he was trying to keep it alive. So he used his own method of preserving the animal. And then, of course, the rest of it is just wood and pieces of kanji and some, I'm not sure what type of material that is on his back, but originally that was a lot, or I mean, I think he might have been alive and then he died and then he wanted to preserve him. Okay. And this piece, you see the metamorphosis happening before your eyes. You can see the man's face in two different directions, plus the beak, probably of a eagle or a hawk or something, and it's almost like he's twisting in the air, maybe trying to become or trying to get out of becoming, almost like what you see in werewolves, in the European, tales of the werewolf. Coyote Chant 2004, charcoal pastel. Again, if you can see the very top, you see a man's face or a woman's face, I suppose you can use both. And then you see the werewolf underneath, or the coyote underneath, or wolf. Here we see the same piece that he was talking about in the little video. Rick Bartow sculpture, From the Mad River to the Little Salmon River, or The Responsibility of Raising a Child, is precariously balanced series of images. Remember, he did talk about how he started the piece one way with the grandmother and then it changed into something else. The sculpture is built on the back of a coyote, the trickster. The grandmother masks on Coyote's back and carries a tattoo that Bartow's mother saw when she was a girl on the face of an elderly woman at Slets. That's another Native American nation in Oregon. A grandfather mask sits on the coyote's hip. A pair of salmons rest on the coyote's back. Salmon give up their lives for their children. A Pacific lamprey eel feeds on the male salmon. A basket holds a smiling baby. It's Bartow's daughter, which makes the sculpture one of hope, not despair. The killdeer is one of the many birds in that piece. The mother killdeer acts like she has broken wing to distract predators from her young. The eagles with wings outstretched rising from the coyote's back, a raven chasing it. The eagle's tail, the moon mask represents a woman on the edged wing, the sun mask represents men. The sculptures of one of 25 pieces established and emerging Native artists in Vantage Point. This actually piece is in the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. Here's another wonderful piece. I think I just passed one I wanted to show you. This one here. This one's very interesting because what you see here is you see a self-portrait of Rick Bartow, if you can see the sergeant stripes on his shoulder. And that's him in what he calls a wheelchair, Buck, because he suffered in 2013 a stroke that debilitated him so much so that he had to learn how to write and read and walk again. But this is him on his wheelchair, Buck. It's beautiful. He had to learn how to write again, so he says he wrote the words on the piece itself. This is acrylic on canvas. A lovely piece. Okay. This is another wonderful piece. I made the one image of the head portion larger so you can see the detail in it. Blue Raven Bundle. I couldn't find very much what that meant, to bundle up a bird like that. So I can't tell you why he created this. Maybe it's part of another message, a symbol of some type that he wanted to do. This is Bird, 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 Crow, Crow, 2013. This is about the time right after his stroke, his major stroke. And he was learning to write again. So, in one of his videos, he said he was writing with his left hand, the words. For some reason, he couldn't write with his right hand, or it was just something he wanted to try. So all those letters are written with his left hand, not his right hand. Surprise. This actually gives me fright. Not like a comic surprise, like, hey, surprise. More like, is death behind you? Is it going to take me? A lot of his art, even his family didn't like. They said it was very dark, and he would get like threatening letters about the type of art that he made. He's creating it from the tragedies and the things that he saw and experienced in his own life, and maybe because we all connect in some way, knowing that maybe we didn't go through that experience ourselves, but we can recognize that in ourselves. And maybe the brilliance of him is that he's able to put that on paper with these different colors that you'd never think would be go together. Yeah, he started small. He had like a few little exhibitions in Oregon, and then one of the major galleries saw his work, and they decided to show him and to represent him, and that's where it happened. Somebody witnessed his art at a local, just small galleries. It's like most artists, they'll start in a small gallery, kind of like milestones to get bigger and bigger, gallery spaces, museums, recognition. And from there, and he was also a musician too, so he had art and musical events. So from there, he was recognized, and it just didn't go, it went forward. And even with his strokes, because he actually had a few strokes, they still committed to him. And yeah. And think this is 1995. He got out of the army 1971. So from that period on to 1979 is when he started painting again. He didn't do anything. He was into, he's alcoholic, substance abuse, destroying himself, a divorce, and a lot of things that were, would actually probably break up a person. Um, in 1979 is when he began drawing again. So this isn't that long after. I mean, it's less than 20 years after he first started, and you're seeing the development of more sophisticated work from here. Let's see. This is Oaxaca. This is a hard one to see actually, but I should get a better print of that one. Let's see. This one is 2009. So here he's not using as much color everywhere. He's limiting his color for effect after Fritz. Now, I don't know who Fritz is or what happened there, but pastel graphite on paper, that's amazing. And if you see the little marks that are little dots, black dots or dashes, he would actually make the charcoal, he would scratch with the charcoal, and it made the little leftover indentations as he passed it through the paper, and that's what he left on there. So this one's interesting because it's a little different than the rest of them, because this is In the Gate, homage to Little Beaver Fry, the 4th, 2004. It's a horseback. It's a jockey on a horse. I just wanted to get it close so you can see the colors against it, the sparse, the allowing the white to consume a lot of the paper. It's very effective because you're forced to look at, well, the eyes of the horse and then of the jockey themselves. That's where I go to. My eye goes directly there. And it's so heavy on that side, on the upper right hand side. It's well balanced by the heavy of the white on the lower right hand side. Crow One is part of the late artist Rick Bartow's series of powerful self-portraits. It shows the artist's dual identities in a state of metamorphosis. Bartow combined Native American and contemporary art traditions to show us transformative and spiritual figures. This drawing is part of the series of artworks created for Who We Are, Autobiographies in Art. The series was commissioned by the Washington State Art Commission in partnership with the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, 1990. GC3. Now, I don't know what that means. I couldn't find a reason for that. I guess more research would allow me to see that. But he had a lot of different exhibitions, so I'm sure it's in the catalogs. There you see what appears to have been a human that is pretty much consumed or in the last moments of transformation into a crow. Or you see GC up in the top of the painting. Maybe that's for somebody. He is known to put words or letters into his paintings to pay tribute to some of the people that helped him in his career. Here he is working on his art. So pain was always part of Rick's transformations, pain and endurance, and something else too, grace, humility, openness, something sweet. I want to say that Rick is a big man, but that doesn't sound right. My wife Laura Grimes, once wrote about her encounter with him. He's a big spirit, at once gentle and rough. She was right. He was a man of extraordinary strength and admitted weakness, just another human being trying to stumble through, and the weakness contrarily made him stronger in ways that strength is not always measured. This is him. He died at 69 years old. I think that's pretty young. He says, we're made up as much of what we've lost as what we've gained. And that's a beautiful statement. April 2nd, 2016, he died in the same place that he was born. I have some citations here if you want to take a time to look him up, but please, on your own, take time to listen to him on his music. Really, really beautiful music.
Art project. Create something showing metamorphosis. Images of artwork inspired by Rick Bartow. Lesson 4, Georgia O'Keeffe.
So she was born 3 years before Vincent van Gogh died. He died in 1890. She looked for inspiration in the West, the West, basically New Mexico. Okay. She was an inspirational figure to Kahlo and to Yayoi Kusama. You remember from last time we talked about Yayoi and how Yayoi had written to O'Keeffe about getting some help, and O'Keeffe inspired Yayoi to leave Japan and come to America to begin her dream. So, okay. And she had met Frida in the 1930s when she was 24. And they had a great relationship, and they continued visiting each other until Frida died. And so, anyways, that's interesting. Oops. What did I just do? Okay, and so she's known as one of the greatest artists, American artist, 20th century. I figured by the time we got to this flower, you guys would have already guessed. I was like, oh. Okay. So we're going to look at a little video about her.
Watch the O'Keeffe video link 1 in the description below.
So what I want you to do is pay attention to the way she colors her paintings, the way she changes hue, and especially like when you look at the shadow on the skull and how she's doing that, and why she's doing. Just think about why she's doing it while we talk about her other pieces. But the cow skull with calico roses, 1931. She became an anti-authoritarian revolutionary, the notary of her lifestyle, sometimes overcoming the originality of her work. She shunned European traditions and influence and resisted all manner of paternalism. Like Piet Mondrian, she never signed her paintings, and like Jackson Pollock, she found Native American art as inspiring as Renaissance art. Eventually, she abandoned the New York City scene and found her reputation and moved west to New Mexico for more authentic artistic experiences. There is a landscape unencumbered by unique neighborhoodless and excessive vegetation. She created work that was timeless, universal, and impersonal. The rugged mountain terrain, with all its fossilized formations, saturated color, and naked wilderness, held an inexhaustible fascination for O'Keeffe and was a source of inspiration for most of her artistic career. Here we see this painting here. Most of these paintings she took back. Well, she took back the skulls and the bones that were bleached white from the sun in New Mexico. She took them back to Lake George. Lake George is in New York City, and that was actually the home, pretty large home of Mr. Stitzler. That was, well, I'm gonna tell you about him in a little bit. But she lived with him and his family for years until he passed, and she decided to move to New Mexico. She says, "To me, bones are beautiful. To me, they are strangely more living than the animals walking around. The bones seem to cut sharply to the center of something that is cleanly alive on the desert, even though it's vast and empty and untouchable and knows no kindness with all its beauty. From the grandeur and the vastness of the western landscape, O'Keeffe extracted a compressed, concise, and reductive style. Breaking away from the constraints of scale, she painted telescopic images that favored the distant and the immediate. She made the small seem large and the large small as she focused on a single isolated object, a mountain, a stone, a flower, a bone." Now this is Alfred Stieglitz, the famous art dealer and renowned photographer, 29 years her elder. He became her, well, first he became her gallerist, then friend, then lover, and then they eventually got married. Georgia O'Keeffe was born November 15, 1887, on a farm in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. She demonstrated early aptitude for art and resolved to become an artist. After graduating from high school in 1905, O'Keeffe attended the Art Institute of Chicago from 1905 to 1906, the Art Students League in New York from 1907 to 1908. Although O'Keeffe won the league's William Merritt Chase Still Life Prize in 1908, she became disillusioned with academic realism. In 1912, she took a summer job for art teachers at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville, with an instructor who introduced her to the progressive ideas of Arthur Wesley Dow. O'Keeffe experimented with these concepts while teaching art in the public school system in Amarillo, Texas, from 1912 to 1914. She returned to New York and took courses at Columbia Teachers College for the academic year of 1914 to 1915, and later began teaching at Columbia College in South Carolina. So if you kind of take a look at the time frame from the time that she went to art school in 1905 to basically 1915, that's 10 years. She's still a young woman and not necessarily serious about her artwork. In 1915, she created these charcoal on paper drawings and 24 by 18. And they don't seem to be a lot, but when you consider that they were made at a time when realism, academic realism, was the most important, that was called art at that time. That's what people, when they wanted to buy a piece of artwork, when they wanted to see art in an art museum, it was the realism of the century. But she started doing these very abstract, unusual drawings, and these drawings were sent to Mr. Skiedler, the art gallerist, and he was a famous photographer, famous art gallery owner, and he ended up exhibiting these pieces at his 291 gallery in 1916. But just look at how they're made. Look at how there seems to be um, depth, depth in them, and contrast, and how she did that. Maybe, you know, erasing parts of the drawing, maybe drawing deeper into some of the pieces, more charcoal in other places, and she obviously took color out by using an eraser or something. But you still see she's created a 3D effect with what she's doing. Here you see kind of the same thing. She's creating an illusion of 3D. Remember, this was new. This was not happening at that time at all. So she was at the beginning end of modernism. These are the last pieces that were displayed in the art gallery by Mr. Schlitz. Again, look at how she uses the charcoal and the contour and the light and darkness of the charcoal to create space and illusion. And this is 1915. So by the time she's doing her pieces in New Mexico, and you see the gradual darkness and then lightness of the color in the future paintings, you kind of understand where that's coming from. She didn't actually use lines to delineate between a space and a non-space. She'd use graduations of color to create that. I'll show you an example. Another thing that she used was she loved to get to a minimal representation of a piece of work. For instance, these are called Jack in the Pulpit. It's a flower that's grown in New York, and it's called Jack in the Pulpit because it appears to be a person in the middle who's a preacher, and when they preached at that time, I think they had something in the background that would appear to look like this, and that's why the flower is called Jack in the Pulpit. But in her youth, Georgia had been fascinated by the Jack in the Pulpit. In 1930, she executed a series of 6 paintings of the common North American flower at Lake George in New York. The National Gallery of Art is home to 5 of these 6 works presently. And the 6th is, I don't know what happened to the 6th one. Something happened to it, doesn't say. The composition is bifurcated by the narrow strip of white that emerges from the tip of the spadix. Green foliage and a hint of cloudy sky are confined to the upper right and left corners. The large magnified representations of the flower embarked upon in the 1920s became her most favorite subjects. So if you can see from before, let me go back, like before when she had the first paintings, she was using the same thing, but now with color. She was doing the same thing, but now with color. And then also digging deep into the plant because she wanted to let people see something. In their busy lives in New York, they didn't have time to actually look at the flower. So she wanted to paint it so they can look at the flower. The last of these pieces shows just the very middle, which was misrepresented by critics at this time, saying that the way that she painted were representation of sexuality, the male and the female. And so she was criticized for that. But she said in a documentary that she, she was recorded saying that no, none of this about sexuality. It was all about, that was what the critics were saying about her work. It was just the way she wanted to represent the artwork. And here you see at the end, number 6, the gradual lightness and then darkness to light to bring that 3D effect. So she was using the same thing she used in 1915 for this piece. So an interesting fact about her was that she met Frida Kahlo in the 1930s. This was when Frida and Diego Rivera went to New York for his exhibition. And they ended up corresponding for years afterwards, where Frida came to visit Georgia at the Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. And O'Keeffe went to visit Frida at Azul, Blue Azul, El Azul, which is where she lived at, Frida lived at. Like Frida, whom O'Keeffe became intimately familiar with her subjects, wanting to merge and become one with them at the moment of creation. I find that I have painted my life, she concluded, things happening in my life without knowing. This is O'Keeffe. Close acquaintance with the subject guided the accurate presentation not only of the outward image, but also of the sensation within, transforming the subjective and personal to the magical and universal. This is interesting about the connection and the relationship between O'Keeffe and Frida. This piece right here by Frida called Self-Portrait Along the Borderline Between Mexico and the United States, 1932, exhibited at the show Beyond the Myth, Oltre il Mito, at the Museo de Cultura in Milan, 2018. You see Frida's painting on the left-hand side, and she's in the middle with a pink dress between Old Mexico and the United States. And right to her right foot, if you're looking at her, it would be the left. Well, if she's facing you, it's her right foot. To the bottom of her right foot, you see the Jack in the Pulpit flowers. There's 3 of them. And this was an homage to O'Keeffe. Can you see them? The 3 little flowers over here. Can you guys all see that?
Mm.
3 little golden flowers. That's what that was homage to O'Keeffe. And of course, here's the Jack in the Pulpit, number 4 to the right-hand side. One thing that O'Keeffe was interested in, shapes and colors and unusual ways to express emotion. She said, I found I could say things with color and shapes that I couldn't say any other way, things I had no words for. And again, you see the way she created work in charcoal on this piece also. See, she didn't use actual lines as, well, I mean, there appears to be lines, yes, but it was the colors, the separation between the colors that she wanted to show the 3D. And it was the way that she painted these that she wanted to show emotion. This is a basic element and technique that she used with most every piece that she created. Oh. The Oriental poppies. These flowers fascinated Georgia, and they were her favorite subject on canvas. She seems to have liked particular flowers, the calla lily, poppy, canna, iris, petunia, and the Jimson weed. O'Keeffe painted Oriental poppies in 1928. This stunning work was declared a groundbreaking art masterpiece. O'Keeffe was very much drawn to the abstract, the abstracting aspects of the flowers. She explores the elements of color, shape, and texture of the objects she painted. She was preoccupied with simple forms from the very beginning and her earliest flower paintings. Colors often bold, frequently carefully modulated, but tends to come across as somewhat flat. In Oriental poppies, O'Keeffe depicted 2 giant poppy flowers, measuring 30 by 40. This oil painting is an explosion of brilliant colors on a vast canvas. lending a mesmerizing effect. O'Keeffe used dazzling red and orange as the main color of the petals. The hollowed center and the inner contours of the flowers are painted in deep purple. The skillful shading and velvety finish of the petals accentuates the vibrancy of the flowers. Oriental poppies almost look like a close-up photograph. O'Keeffe did not give background to her paintings to artfully draw focus on the flowers themselves. The absence of context in the painting presents them in a new light as pure abstracts. Oriental poppies exudes a starting pull, casting a hypnotic spell on the viewer. This is another piece that she's very famous for, and this is interesting. In 1936, cosmetic executive Elizabeth Arden commissioned O'Keeffe to paint Jimson Tweed to hang in the exercise room at the new Arden Sports Salon in New York City. The result was the largest of O'Keeffe's flower paintings. The artist placed the four blossoms in an exuberant design that repeated the tight rhythm of the pinwheel-shaped plant. She emphasized her subject's deep beauty with light, restricted palette. The black iris. The iris is a familiar image in Western art, frequently used in Christian iconography. Its sword-like leaves were especially embodied as a symbol for Mary's suffering, a pictorial metaphor which might also have been familiar to O'Keeffe from her Catholic upbringing and her parochial schooling. O'Keeffe's famous irises were an important preoccupation for many years. She favored the black iris, which she could only find at certain New York flowers for about 2 weeks each spring. Unlike Impressionist flower paintings such as Irises by Vincent van Gogh, O'Keeffe's enlargements and abstractions derived the flower have been explained in gynecological terms, almost clinical to their precision. We talked about that a little bit. Such explications, once the province of Freudian critics, have more recently repeated in feminist interpretations of the flower. Linda Nochsland, for example, read black iris as a metamorphical metaphor for female genitalia, insisting that connection is immediate, concrete, and the two meanings are almost interchangeable. In this merger of botany and anatomy, Notchler found reflection of the unity of the feminine and the natural order, a concept which enjoyed great vogue early in this last century. But O'Keeffe rejected the notion of her flowers as sexual metaphors. This is something she feels is created by the viewer, who applies his or her own associations to the works, not hers, O'Keeffe maintained.
Art project. Create something by looking closely at it. Images of artwork inspired by Georgia O'Keeffe. Lesson 5. Frida Kahlo.
So we're going to be studying about Frida Kahlo. And what I want you to listen to is this.
Watch the Kahlo video, link 1, in the description below.
The thing about Chavela Vargas, a singer in Mexico in the 1940s, she had spent time with Frida Kahlo in her Casa Azul in Mexico, and it was rumored that they had had a relationship while she lived there with Diego and Frida during that time period. 1940s, that was after that Frida had remarried Diego in San Francisco. This painting that you see right here is called The Two Fridas. It's a huge painting. It's one of her only huge paintings that she ever did. And the thing about this painting is that it's symbolic of Frida's duality, her pain, her suffering, and everything she went through as a child. And it symbolizes her German background. Her father's German, her mother's Mexican, and her Mexican ethnicity too, or nationality. And so in this painting here, she has two wardrobes. The one on our right side is a customary traditional Mexican Tijuana outfit that the women used in Culiacan, Mexico. And the one to the left of us is a white traditional European outfit, basically a wedding gown. She did this painting in right after she divorced Diego in 1939. And this is the most popular. This is the one that's hailed as one of her one of her masterpieces. Because although she wasn't a technical artist, as it were, she was able to, in her symbols, just like you did, Jennifer, um, talk about her life and her pain inside this piece. For instance, the hearts in Aztec, in Aztec history, the heart was the center of the earth, was the center of the universe, the center of the human being. And many times the Aztecs in ceremonies would cut out the heart of a warrior from the opposing side, and that was put into a flame and burned, and that was in order to worship and pay credence to the gods. So the heart is a very important symbol in the Mexican traditions. Now here you see the heart on Frida with her customary Mexican attire that is connected to the other Frida that's much lighter skin and more European. And the both hearts are connected, as you can see, but then you see on the European Frida where the blood um, is being drawn, and she attempts to clip it, but then it still filters down onto her dress. And um, this was made because of the hardship that she had experienced through her life, specifically her divorce to Diego Rivera, who was he was a womanizer for sure. But they did have an open marriage when they married in 1929. They agreed on this, but it was after Diego had a relationship with her sister that Frida just fell apart. But from her falling apart, from her relationship with Diego, which was very passionate, but very also full of a lot of pain and suffering. This is what came out of that. And but what she holds in her hand, the Mexican culture, Frida, is a little portrait of Diego Rivera. So she still has him in her heart. She still loves him, and she still cherishes him for the man that she was. She did refer to him as the love of her life. She still holds that because she loves him so much still, even though they had divorced and even though he had committed adultery with her sister and all the other women that he had been engaged with. But it was her sister that did the most damage. And so Diego loved Frida in her traditional attire, the Mexican traditional attire. He loved her in that outfit, and she would create many different outfits in the Mexican tradition, and that's what she wore when she toured New York, San Francisco, Detroit, and Paris. This is what she wore. This is what symbolized her, and this is what people loved about her, was her originality and the fact that she produced these beautiful outfits herself. But he did not like the more Caucasian looking Frida in the traditional European attire. He did not like that. And so that's why she painted this painting, to symbolize that um, she's two people, but she heals herself. As you see her holding her hand, she heals herself. It was nobody that was going to heal her. It was going to be, she was healing herself. And you know that at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which caused her right leg to be severely destroyed, and ended up where her right leg was shorter than her left leg. So she was disabled from that. And then she was disabled from the bus crash when she was 18 years old, which basically broke her back. And she had tons of surgeries and plastic girdles that she had to wear. And she had also where she had to use she ended up having her right leg amputated and used a little um, attachment that was created just for her. But the thing about Frida is that she didn't let her pain and her suffering stop her. She used that in her art to represent herself and maybe even to connect to other people. But it wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s, and then again in current fashion, she was symbolized as a very important and powerful woman. She didn't consider herself a feminist because that wasn't a term that was used back then, but she was a very strong woman and portrayed herself that way in her attitude, her behaviors, her art. In in 1940s is when she met Chavala, but it wasn't that was not her first female relationship. She had a female relationship with in Paris with oh my gosh, I can't remember her name. The dancer, Dorothy. Anyways, I'll get back to that. She had a relationship with her too. She had several other relationships too. Well, you remember her relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe. That was platonic, but the other relationships were romantic. But Frida was forever in love with Diego, and that was her main love and attraction forever and ever. She did remarry Diego in 1940 in San Francisco, and they spent the rest of their lives together, living in the Casa Azul. He did have another home next door so that they can separate and give each other space. But it's just she is such an important figure in Mexico and now in the world because she's the most recognized female artist that there is in the world today even. um what I want to say is that it was through her pain and suffering she created this to heal herself, and that's what it was meant to do, heal herself. Like when she had the bus crash and she was laying in her bed in Mexico and had to be on her back for a year, her mother constructed a special uh, platform for her to be able to paint underneath her paintings as she lay on the bed. And then after that, she was able to paint when she got better with all the different surgeries that she had. She was able to paint upright. But I think what's most important about her is that she learned to self heal, which is very important for many people because you can't depend on other services, government services, or your family or the people you most trust. Unfortunately, at times, to heal yourself, it is always within yourself to heal yourself. And that's what I capture most about her. And the song La Llorona from Chavela Vargas is really a song about a mother that had a relationship with a Mexican mother that had a relationship with a man who was very rich and popular in the town that she lived. Well, she ended up giving birth to three sons or three children from this gentleman. They never got married. The family of the man was very rich and wanted him to marry a woman with status and money and clout. And so when he left the woman and he married the the other young lady with clout and money and reputation, etc., La Llorona went into um, a craze, a fanatic craze, and she ended up throwing her three children into the river. And so the legend goes that every night La Llorona, the crier, goes into the field next to the river where she threw her children, and she cries. She cries for her children that she threw in the river. And that's a very sad story. And it's funny that Chavela had sang that song in well, not only in the movie that you saw with Selma Hayek, which actually that was her in the movie, but she had sang that during the time that she spent time with Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo and Diego used to have these huge parties where musicians and artists and singers and popular people in the culture came to their home in the Casa Azul, and they had wonderful big parties, and Chavala would sing at these parties. But I just find it interesting that Chavala had used that song about the woman throwing her children in the river, and now you have Frida crippled and in constant pain for the rest of her life in the same place, and and the inspirations that Frida got throughout her life to paint this one iconic painting. But during my research, I did find several um, in Spanish conversations between several people, authors and writers, that actually spoke to Chavala and talked to her about the relationship. So it wasn't open, obviously, as the culture didn't allow that, but it was known. uh, they did know about that, but it wasn't until really that Chavala Vargas held that interview and told the Mexican reporters of their relationship. And Chavala was younger than her Chavala was born in 1919, and Frida was born in 1907. And so Chavala looked at Frida like, like the spectacular woman that she was. And oh my gosh, I mean, she was very influenced by her and very taken by her. And Frida controlled the relationship because, again, it's a taboo thing. And Frida was inviting her to her home where she lived with Diego. So yeah, very interesting, I thought. But I think that's part of the artist that she is, in her duality that she is, in hiding her pain, and becoming very, party goer. She drank tequila, she danced, she did all sorts of things. She was the life of the party. People loved her. So she hid her pain that way. She hid her bisexuality, by having affairs with women, along with affairs with men too. And a real famous relationship she had was with Leon Trotsky. He was from Russia, and he had stayed with her because he was exiled from the Soviet Union because of his communist beliefs, and he stayed there with his wife. Her name was Natalia, in 1937, and Frida had a relationship with him too. So I don't know if it was Frida's ability to connect with people so easily, and maybe that she didn't just connect with them emotionally and uh, philosophically. Maybe she also needed to connect with them physically to have a whole um, relationship with them. Well, think about the time too. I mean, Freudism was coming into popular um, psychological studies, and things were happening with that. There were revolutions going on. What else? The Surrealist movement was huge during that time. So it almost begs the question of, like, does art follow society, or does society follow art? Or was she? I mean, she didn't leave her home very much in Casa Azul because of her handicaps. And so there wasn't any Instagram or Facebook or internet for her to research. And I'm sure that it wasn't easy to go see, popular art in the museums in Mexico, because maybe where she lived, there wasn't uh, art galleries that exhibited modern artists of the time. So it just, for me, it begs the question, why, they would call her surrealist. Or like, Georgia, why her art was so feminine and feminist, and parts of the women's genitalia, so it's, but don't you see commonalities with how Rick Bartow, how um, he took care of his emotional pain from Vietnam, um, and he used art to heal himself, and he displayed his art in kind of even grotesque ways. And Frida had some pretty grotesque paintings, really horrible ones. One especially during the three miscarriages that she had. She had one where she's laying on a bed, and her stomach is torn up, and organs are just flying in the sky, and really grotesque ones. Take a minute to look at all her paintings, and there was some really grotesque uh, depictions of her pain. Her father had been a photographer, so there was artistic um, heritage there, because her father had been a photographer, German. Well, he came from Germany. He was a famous photographer in the city that they lived. So, and she was photographed since she was a child. So all those connections, make sense of how all these selfies, as they were, you call them today, because she would only see herself in the mirror. Like when she laid in her bed, above her bed, her mother had installed a huge mirror so she can see herself. And so she painted a lot of her face because of that, because she was her only model. She did paint pictures of her sister and her family too. So, yeah, you take what you have in front of you, you do something with it, but it's so dramatic, like, I don't know, like Vincent, he was tortured emotionally. And I mean, Frida never went and sought, any kind of medical care or anything like that, but it was her pain that was her suffering. She also, the way she painted the face was always kind of stoic. And she had said about that she painted like that because that's how she was Catholic, but she wasn't like practicing Catholic. And so, but she used a lot of the iconography of Catholicism in her paintings. And she would paint faces that were stoic because that's how the gods were painted. That's how the figures in the church, and that's how the figures in the books that were read. And it's reminiscent of Vincent because his faces were always stoic, kind of unemotional too. I mean, I'm sorry you guys suffer from some physical problem, maybe back pain or neck pain or something, but to have a constant back pain from the broken back that she had. She even had her back, what do you call it? She had a surgery so that they would, what is that called? It's a surgery that causes your spine to be immobile. They mobilized her spine so she can no longer do anything like bend a lot, or she had that surgery, but there was constant pain. She was 47 years old when she died. Yeah, Diego died in 57, so a few years after her. I bet he died of a broken heart himself. I don't know, maybe. But yeah, she didn't live a long time, 47. I know I picked one painting, and the painting because I think this is everything. There's some other ones that are just dramatic, but this is everything. This is the one that's basically human size, and it's just basically the culmination of all her talents, all her suffering. This came at 1939 when she'd already been working up towards being not just the wife of Diego Rivera, the little diminutive wife of the huge popular muralist Diego Rivera that painted murals in Detroit and New York and all over the world. No, she now started becoming an artist on her own. And that's pretty rare. I mean, I know some artists had spouses like Jackson Pollock, Lee Krantz, and she did not become a very popular artist until much later. But because of the way she became very popular and people got to see her art. Of course, Diego supported her, but he was more into his own art. He was more into his own relationships that he had with other women, because they would live apart many, many, many times. Not years apart, but they would live months apart where he would travel and she couldn't travel with him. So I don't know. I think she's a very and now she's basically a feminist movement. Her strength and power, and it's like we're recreating her life as we want it to be, just like O'Keeffe, and we're recreating it. Okay, so you're wondering what your task is for next week. Now, next week is to create something about a duality in you, something dual in you. Maybe you are left and right-handed, duality. Maybe you use your left brain and your right brain just equally as strong. Something dual. Maybe you like pasta, but you like pho too. I mean, that's kind of similar, but I'm just that's funny. But I mean, something in duality about yourself that you can produce on a piece of paper, or however you want to do it. Like we've talked before, however you want to do that.
Art project. Create something about a duality in yourself. Images of artwork inspired by Frida Kahlo. Lesson 6. Jean-Michel Basquiat.
So we're going to talk about Jean-Michel Basquiat. like every artist that we've talked about has similarities, and he of course has similarities to them as far as mental illness, but they also were all groundbreakers. They all started or were part of large, huge movements in art. And he was a huge movement in art in the neo-expressionism. So yeah, and he was the youngest of all of them. So I kind of wanted to go a little bit chronological. But yeah, he was a Brooklyn born painter. His father's Haitian, his mother's Puerto Rican. So he grew up in New York in the 1970s to become one of the most influential, internationally renowned artists of the late 20th century. So here we go. He was born December 22nd, 1960. That's how young. Yeah, 1960. So we're going to talk about real quick. I just want you to keep this in mind during this period of Basquiat art movement. Well, I call it his art movement, but it's the neo-expressionism. What was going on in the 1980s, as some of you may know, some of you may be too young, but you had the MTV, you had cable TV, you had game consoles, Cold War escalation, the Iran-Contra affairs, crack cocaine epidemic, the AIDS crisis was horrible. Materialism and consumerism were huge during that time period. Also, the use of credit cards and loans was huge during that time. The rise of the yuppie, explosion of blockbuster movies, Reaganomics, basically the supply side economics, where you buy more goods and invest in businesses, and somehow by doing that, all the money will trickle down to the haves and have-nots, basically the have-nots. It turned out not to work, and our debt had risen 4 times the amount that it had before in the 1970s. It was basically the sugar-coated era of self-centerism and materialism. So think about that. Think about it's kind of, and it was also during the right, politically, it was the right conservatism that was going on, and that was a lot of the yuppies. But if you think of that, what's going on, a lot of cable TV, a lot of movies, a lot of people just getting computers. They were just getting the computers and playing games on computers, and that was the beginning of that era. And so here we talk a little about neo-expressionism developed as a reaction from conceptual art and minimal art of the 1970s. Just like Georgia O'Keeffe, she was a minimalist, as you remember, how she minimalized to the very nano, part of the plant, just so that she can express how she felt about art. And so this was counter to that. So neo-expressionists returned to portraying recognizable objects such as a human body, although many times abstract, in a rough and violently emotional way using vivid colors. So here's Jean-Michel Basquiat. Like I told you before, I'm really bad at pronouncing names, so I'm really glad that I found this. Is Jean-Michel Basquiat. So I guess you don't even pronounce a T at the end. Well, he was born in, like I said, December in 1960, and he unfortunately died in 1988. He, as it says here, he was a pop icon, graffiti artist, musician, and neo-expressionist painter. He was very, very young. He's a very young man. Again, his father was Haitian, his mother was from Puerto Rico, and he lived most of his life in New York City. His mother instilled the love of art in him because she realized real early that he had this talent. He did very badly in high school, basically dropping out of high school, but his art was always there, and his mother promoted him and encouraged him to do art. His father was very difficult with him because the young man didn't like school, failed high school. His father was really cruel and very difficult with him. Later on, it turned out that his mother had to be admitted into a mental ward, and young Basquiat was living with his father, and his father was violently abusive towards him. That's another reason why Jean decided to move into the streets, and he basically was homeless, moving from one couch to the next couch because he didn't want to live with his father, who was very strict with him. Also, his teachers noticed his artistic abilities and they encouraged him. As it says here, he knew English, French, and Spanish, and he made money by selling small homemade postcards and T-shirts. If you ever saw the movie Basquiat, it shows Andy Warhol and another associate sitting in an expensive restaurant in New York City, and the young Basquiat, at the age of 17, I believe, goes into the restaurant, takes his little postcards in there, and shows them to Andy Warhol and says, "Will you buy one of these?" And Warhol and his associate were sitting there looking at the postcards. I mean, out of the blue, this young man just went to him, um, and Andy really loved them. He saw something in those little postcards that propelled him to want to take this young man under his arm and teach him about the art world and encourage him. And that developed in a wonderful relationship that the two had. It was more like Andy with his father, the father that Basquiat never had. Well, he had the one father, but this father encouraged him, didn't beat him, didn't humiliate him. This father taught him and introduced him to influential art people in New York City. He began before he met Andy with his graffiti on walls and empty spaces and anywhere he can do his art. It was basically he had this student named Samo. Samo was basically, I have a little thing about that. Samo was basically pronounced Samo, and it was a graffiti tag, as we see, we've probably heard about tags nowadays. It means the same old shit, which I thought that was kind of interesting. Samo, the same old shit. And him and his friend Al Diaz created this, and they would tag everywhere they could. And he began getting even some publicity about this. And in 1979, he was on a show called The TV Party, and he was interviewed. And he was so young, and you can see him, and he'd shaved his head, and he was this little anarchist, but just bouncy and sweet, not aggressive or violent, but he was this sweet young man, very defiant, but very much into what he wanted. He knew what he wanted, even at that young age. He made friends with all sorts of people. Blondie, David Bowie, oh gosh, Keith Haring, Rudy. Keith Haring, he made friends with him. And in this little screen shows that he was regularly showing his work with friends like Madonna, Bowie, Andy Warhol, Keith Haring, and he would actually wear these expensive suits, which he didn't pay for. Andy Warhol did supply funds for him to do his art, and one of the art curators let him use her art gallery so he can do his art, because of course he was living in the street, he had nothing. So let's see. So these are some of his friends, as you see. I took some pictures. That's his girlfriend on the lower left-hand side. And there's Blondie. She bought his first painting for $200 because they were friends. And I just think that's, and Madonna, he dated Madonna. It's an interesting young man. Okay, so I'm going to show a quick little video here.
Watch the Basquiat video link 1 in the description below.
So again, here we see the symbol, his symbol of the crown, and Samo, and he actually used that copyright sometimes for some of his work. But Samo, we heard about that right now. Okay, so what we're going to do is, while you look at the paintings that we're going to see, I want you to think about what he's trying to do. He was quoted as saying, "I don't think about art while I work. I try to think about life." And that's what he painted, about his life and the life that he saw around him. He spoke about that in his art. So I want you to do is analyze. What do you see? The shapes, lines, values, colors, patterns, and subjects. Interpret it in your own way. You don't have to talk about it, but we'll talk about it at the end. Or if you want to talk about it, just say, "Hey, let's talk about that piece." That would be fine with me too. What if the art could talk? What would it say to you? Some of it's very cryptic, so I found it difficult myself to look at some of the art and try to interpret it in my own words. I just found a nice rhythm, and I saw colors put together. He used mainly a lot. He usually used the main primary colors of red, yellow, and blue. I just love that he was able to create such impact in what he did by removing pieces of art, by layering other, large swashes of paint on top of them, and then bringing something out from the back. What emotional response? And we're going to look at this one real quick that sold for $30 million. And it is a 27-inch by 121-inch piece. So this is humongous. It's actually two pieces put together. And we're just going to look real quick at it, flesh and spirit. So this is the, I'm going to go to the next slide where we're going to see the top pieces. And when he was a child and he broke his arm at the age of 8, he was hit by a car. He went to the hospital and had to stay, overnight. And his mother gave him the book Grey's Anatomy. And Grey's Anatomy had all these pictures and about the human body and how it looked internally, everything. It's basically an encyclopedia of the human body. And so you can see that he used those images in a lot of his work. For instance, right here on the left-hand side, he talks about ribs. Remember flesh and spirit, ribs. Okay, so he's detailing the ribs. And then on the bottom, he says potato. And then he seems to have split it. And then he has Vostok 3. Could be from Russian spaceships or something. But you can see that he had created stuff underneath, and then he painted over them with white acrylic. He uses a lot of arrows to sense direction, probably to get your eye to go in that direction. On the right-hand side, you say fissure of Roland, spirit, the brain, motor area, and then cerebrium, diagram, structure of brain, medulla. So it's like, okay, flesh and spirit. Maybe this is the flesh right here that he's talking about. And this could possibly be the spirit. I don't know. He's got the scapula and the femur. He's got the hand drawing. On the right-hand side, the third something worthless to brain, flesh and spirit. And then that looks like a skyline. To me, that looks like a skyline. And petrol. Is he talking about oil? Is he talking about, what is he talking about? Do any of you know or believe? How do you interpret what he's trying to say? I can go back to the first one. Oops. I don't know. Oil stick, gesso, acrylic, and paper on canvas. I don't seem to be able to interpret it. I don't know what you all think. He had a library of books where he created his work, and he would actually go into those books and read about them and look at the pictures and depict those pictures on his art. So he took a lot of it and used it as symbolism. And he's known to have words, and then he'd cross out the word. Okay, now talk a little bit about what his art is worth now. This is a painting that he did 1982, the same time period that he did Flesh and Spirit. And this painting had no title. It was just skull. And this billionaire, Yasaku Maezawa in Tokyo, bought it. $110.5 million. I think it was 2017 he bought this. Can you imagine? I mean, it's extraordinary. such a young man, and then the art world is crazy for his art, crazy, constantly going up. His work is constantly going up. I mean, can you see something like this on a wall? Yeah, I remember street art where I grew up in Los Angeles, and people would paint over other people's graffiti and then other people's graffiti. And you ended up seeing like all these distorted things all over the place because there was always this big competition of who got their name out there in the walls. And it's almost like I see this here. It's like maybe there was graffiti before, and then so he decided, well, I'm going to do something else with it. Then he painted some of it over and some of it he left. And then again, he does it again. So it's like he's destroying the first 3 or 4 or 5 layers, whatever, I don't know. Well, you think about even though there was a economic downfall, there was a recession, and there was a high inflation and high unemployment too. But who bought this art? It was the wealthy.
Yeah.
And who told the wealthy this art was something? Andy Warhol, the critics, and they allowed for these artists to get popularity, and the investors in the art market, which were making money because there are tax breaks for those very very rich people. They bought all this art because they knew, hey, you know what? This will be an investment for me. I mean, this billionaire here, 2017 in Japan, he's nothing part of that, but he's a billionaire. He wants to collect art because that's what he loves to do.
Yeah.
Now this one JC paid for an orange and white black acrylic oil stick work featuring the Empire State Building under the trademark of the Basquiat crown. So JC bought this painting, Mecca, 4.5 million. JC and Beyonce actually have some more of his art. And okay, here is, this is a neo-expressionist artist type of work that we talked about, depicting subjects in almost raw and brutish manner, newly resurrected in their frequently large-scale works. The highly textural and expressive brushwork and intense colors that had been rejected by the immediate preceding art movements. Just like you guys said, this art had been rejected, but I honestly think it was his friendship with Andy that helped him. But also, in contrary to that, Andy's Warhol's work was not doing as well during that introduction. So Andy was looking for inspiration, and he found in Basquiat. He found it in him, which inspired Warhol to do his own style, because Warhol was surrounded by muses, and this was his ultimate muse, this young man that he could nurture and help. Yeah. There's another more distinctive in the draw marks and the head. Oops. Okay. The skull. I love this piece. That's 1981, so that was before the other ones that he made. These ones seem more controlled too, to me. I don't know. The Boxer, 1982. This is cool. But again, you see how he paints over the backgrounds just to get what he wants. Scratching and taking off of pieces of work. I look at this one, it says surrounded by snakes. He must have seen that, how, yeah, any performer is always taken advantage of by everybody else, taking from them. And he's got a halo on top of his head. That's beautiful. The dog. This is Andy Warhol, obviously. Dos cabezas, 2 heads. That's what it means in Spanish. I like it. Sometimes he would just paint on just pieces of wood or whatever. Oh. I like that one too. Beautiful, brilliant colors. Oh. I think my mouse is running out of power. Oh. Picasso, I love this one. Picasso. Because 1984 he painted this, not thinking the fact that he himself was going to be at the level of Picasso. Never even thought of it, He never, wasn't about him, Titled, same one. So portrait. Flexible. Oh, definitely. Flexible. Look at that. That's so much fun.
That is nice.
You guys can take time to look at these, for yourselves, and this is
Agreed.
so beautiful. Oh, this looks like a Max Roach. Must have been an entertainer or something, because he looks like he's playing.
Mhm.
There we go, trumpet. Somebody playing trumpet. BB, don't know who that, with the crown. That's awesome. They did.
Yeah.
Him and some of his friends did start a music group, but it's turned out they were really, really bad. They were really bad. What it was a marketing thing, so he did it. Exactly. It was the 80s, so why not? Well, we're come to a conclusion in the class, but just real quick, after he died in 1988 in New York, he died of heroin. He did heroin. Unfortunately, he had a bad, I don't know how heroin works, but something happened and he passed. And it's actually after Warhol had died. He was so depressed after Warhol had died, because he had died maybe a year before. I'm not sure. But anyways, he died and sent him into huge depression. And his mother was still in the mental institute, and so he just declined, and he was found in his apartment, dead of a heroin addiction, 27 years old. And when people went into his apartment afterwards to find art, they found 917 drawings, 25 sketchbooks, 85 prints, 171 paintings. So he left, huge collection for people to admire and learn from, you know. So that's it. That's our hero.
Thank you to our Art Spark Texas funders: Texas Commission on the Arts, St. David's Foundation, Cultural Arts City of Austin Economic Development, National Endowment for the Arts Creative Forces, Austin Public Library, Donald D. Hamill Foundation.